Voices that tell a story so raw and so real that you feel it in your bones, long after the last note has faded. And then there's the voice of Hank Williams, a voice that came out of the backwoods of Alabama, thin and reedy, but filled with more heartbreak, more truth, and more poetry than 1,000 lifetimes. They called him the Hillbilly Shakespeare, a grand title for a man who often looked like he was one step away from falling apart right there on stage. But it's a name he earned, word by painful word, song by lonesome song. Because Hank Williams didn't just write about heartache, he mainlined it. He didn't just sing about the bottle, he was baptized in it. He didn't just croon about a lost highway, he lived every single mile of it. This isn't just the story of a country music star. This is the story of a man who was a walking, breathing, singing contradiction. A man who wrote some of the most enduring hymns to God's light while living in the deepest, darkest shadows. A man who craved love but seemed destined to destroy it. A man whose body was a roadmap of pain right from the very beginning. A soul that was as lonesome as the midnight train he sang about, and just as powerful. This is the story of the man, not the myth. And it's a story that, once you hear it, you'll never forget. To understand Hank Williams, you have to understand the world that made him. Imagine the American South in the 1920s and 30s, a land of red clay and deep green pines, still nursing the wounds of a not-so-distant past. It was a place of stark contrasts, fervent, foot-stomping religion on Sunday morning, and the rowdy, sin-soaked release of the Honky Tonk on Saturday night. Life was hard. The Great Depression had a chokehold on the nation, and in rural Alabama that grip was bone-crushing. Into this world, on September 17, 1923, Hiram Williams was born. And from his very first breath, pain was his constant companion. He was born with spina bifida occulta, a birth defect where the spine doesn't fully close. In Hank's case, it was a hidden torment, a secret source of agonizing back pain that would shadow him for every one of his 29 years. It was a pain that doctors in that era barely understood, let alone knew how to treat. So from a young age, Hank learned to live with a fire in his back, a fire he would spend the rest of his life trying to quench with anything he could find. His father, Lon, was a veteran of the Great War, a man broken by shell shock who would spend most of Hank's childhood in and out of veterans' hospitals. This left young Hank in the care of his mother, Lily, and Lily Williams was a force of nature, a woman as tough and unyielding as the Alabama soil. She was the family's anchor and its engine, a domineering, fiercely protective woman who saw a spark in her frail, quiet son. Lily ran boarding houses, worked as a nurse, and did whatever it took to keep her family afloat. She was Hank's first manager, his first booking agent, and his first, and perhaps most complicated, love. Their relationship was a tangled web of devotion and dependence, a push and pull that would shape his view of women for the rest of his life. In this hard-scrabble existence, music was more than just entertainment. It was a lifeline. It was in the gospel hymns his mother played on the church organ, their soaring melodies promising a better world, and it was in the raw, earthy sounds of the street. In Georgiana, Alabama, a young gawky Hank found his first true mentor, not in a music hall or a church, but on a street corner. His name was Rufus Payne, an African-American bluesman who went by the name T-Tot. T-Tot was a street performer, a man who played for nickels and dimes, his music a potent brew of struggle and soul. He saw something in the skinny white kid who followed him around, and for the price of a hot meal or a few coins, he taught Hank more than just chords. He taught him rhythm. He taught him phrasing. He taught him that the blues wasn't just a style of music. It was a feeling. It was the sound of pain being turned into something beautiful. From Tetot, Hank learned to infuse his music with that deep, mournful blue note, a sound that would become the very soul of his own songs. It was a cross-pollination of cultures, a secret shared between a black street musician and a poor white kid that would go on to change the course of American music forever. By his early teens, Hank was already a seasoned performer. Lily, ever the pragmatist, saw her son's talent not just as a gift but as a commodity. She would drive him to dusty schoolhouses, smoky beer joints, and any other place that would let him sing for a few dollars. He formed his first band, the Drifting Cowboys, a name that evoked a romantic, wandering spirit that was a far cry from their reality of cramming into a beat-up car and driving all night for a gig. It was during this time that the two great and ultimately destructive forces of Hank's life took hold: Audrey Shepherd and alcohol. Audrey Mae Shepherd was a beautiful, ambitious, and fiercely determined woman. When Hank met her, she was a single mother with a fiery spirit that matched his own. Their attraction was instantaneous and explosive. It was a love affair born in the crucible of honky tonks and late-night drives, a passion as intense and volatile as a summer thunderstorm. They married in 1944 at a Texaco station in Andalusia, Alabama, a fittingly unceremonious start to one of country music's most legendary and destructive love stories. Audrey wasn't content to be a musician's wife. She wanted to be a star in her own right. She pushed Hank. She managed him. She fought for him. She saw his genius, but she also saw her own path to fame through him. She insisted on singing with him despite a voice that was, to put it kindly, limited. Their duets were often a source of tension, both on and off stage, but their relationship, for all its turmoil, was also the wellspring of his greatest work. When they were good, they were, hey, good looking. When they were bad, and they were often bad, they were your cheatin' heart. Audrey was the muse he couldn't live with and couldn't live without. Their fights were legendary, fueled by jealousy, ambition, and Hank's ever-deepening reliance on alcohol to numb the constant gnawing pain in his back and the growing pressures of his career. That career was a slow, grueling climb. For years, he was a regional star, a big fish in the small pond of the Louisiana Hayride, a popular radio show that was seen as the stepping stone to the hallowed ground of country music, the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. The Opry was the pinnacle, the mother church of country music, and they were notoriously wary of Hank. They'd heard the stories of his drinking, his unreliability. They weren't sure this raw, undisciplined honky tonker was their kind of star. Then, in 1949, Hank recorded a song that would change everything. It was an old Tin Pan Alley tune called Lovesick Blues, a song he'd been playing live to wild reactions. His record producer Fred Rose was hesitant, but Hank insisted. What he did with that song was pure alchemy. He took a fairly standard novelty song and injected it with a dose of his signature high lonesome sound, complete with a yodel that was part hiccup, part sob. The record was a sensation. It exploded across the country, a sound so unique and compelling that it couldn't be ignored. The Grand Ole Opry could no longer look away. On June 11, 1949, Hank Williams walked onto the stage of the Ryman Auditorium for the first time. The audience, already buzzing with the energy of his hit record, was about to witness something they had never seen before. He was a skinny, almost painfully shy-looking figure, but when he opened his mouth and that first lonesome wail of lovesick blues echoed through the old church, the place erupted. The crowd went into a frenzy. They stomped, they screamed, they demanded encore after encore. The story goes that he performed an unprecedented 6 encores that night. a moment that shattered the Opry's normally staid and controlled atmosphere. The show's host, Red Foley, had to practically beg the audience to let the show continue. In that one night, Hank Williams had conquered Nashville. He was no longer just a star, he was a phenomenon. The years that followed were a whirlwind. The hits kept coming, a seemingly endless stream of songs that have since become the bedrock of the country music canon. Cold, Cold Heart, Jambalaya, On the Bayou, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, Hey, Good Lookin'. He was writing his life, transmuting his pain into 3-minute masterpieces of simple, devastating honesty. I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, a song he originally intended to be spoken word, is a perfect example. That's not just songwriting, it's poetry. It's the work of a man who understood the profound loneliness of the human condition because he felt it in every fiber of his being. But as his star ascended, his personal life was in a freefall. The fame, the money, the constant touring, it was all a pressure cooker. And Hank's only release valve was the bottle. The drinking became more severe, his behavior more erratic. He was now a full-blown alcoholic, his addiction intertwined with the morphine and other painkillers he was taking for his back. His relationship with Audrey, always a battlefield, became a war zone. Their love, which had inspired so much of his music, was now a casualty of his addictions and their clashing ambitions. Their divorce in 1952 was a brutal public affair that left Hank adrift. He was a man who wrote about home and family with a deep, aching longing, and now his own was gone. The Grand Ole Opry, the institution he had fought so hard to join, had finally had enough. In August of 1952, after a string of no-shows and drunken performances, the Opry's manager, Jim Denny, did the unthinkable. He fired Hank Williams. It wasn't meant to be permanent, but rather a harsh wake-up call. You get yourself sober, Hank, the message was, and you can come back. But for a man whose identity was so wrapped up in his music and his place on that stage, it was a devastating blow. The Hillbilly Shakespeare had been exiled from his kingdom. This is where the story of Hank Williams often gets hazy, glossed over in the rush to get to its tragic end. But this final year of his life is perhaps the most revealing, a period of desperate searching and rapid decline. Fired from the Opry, divorced from Audrey, Hank retreated from Nashville, returning to Montgomery, Alabama, the city where his career began. He was a king in exile, but he was still Hank Williams, and the crowds still clamored for him. He moved back in with his mother, Lily, a full circle return to the woman who had started it all. But this was a different Hank. He was gaunt, his hair was thinning, and the light in his eyes was fading. He was still writing, still performing, but there was a new desperation to it. He started seeing a man named Toby Marshall, a charlatan who called himself a doctor, but was in reality a convicted forger who had bought his medical diploma. Marshall promised to cure Hank of his addictions, but his primary prescription was chloral hydrate, a powerful and dangerous sedative. When mixed with alcohol, it was a lethal cocktail. Hank was essentially entrusting his life to a con man. During this period, he had a brief, intense affair with a woman named Bobby Jett, which resulted in a pregnancy. Just days after the baby, Antha Bell Jett, was born, Hank was gone. He also entered into a new whirlwind marriage with a 19-year-old woman named Billie Jean Jones. They had 3 separate wedding ceremonies, 2 of them public spectacles on the same day in New Orleans, almost as if he was trying to create a public performance of a happiness he couldn't find in private. But perhaps one of the most haunting and little-known episodes from this final year is Hank's creation of a new persona, Luke the Drifter. Under this alias, he recorded a series of recitations, moralistic tales set to a simple musical backing. These weren't the honky-tonk anthems he was famous for. They were somber, sermon-like stories about sin, redemption, and the final judgment. Songs like The Funeral and Men with Broken Hearts. It was as if Hank was having a conversation with himself, a battle for his own soul being played out on vinyl. Luke the Drifter was the man Hank wanted to be, wise, repentant, God-fearing. Hank Williams was the man he was, a sinner, lost and lonesome. The duality is heartbreaking. He was simultaneously writing songs about carousing and songs about salvation, a man torn between the light he saw and the darkness he lived in. There's a chilling quote attributed to him during this time. After a particularly bad show, a friend tried to console him, telling him he still had 1,000,000 friends. Hank's reply was quiet and laced with a profound sadness. "I know, but I don't have one I can talk to." Here was the most famous country singer in the world, a man whose voice was in every jukebox and on every radio, and he was utterly, crushingly alone. The lonesomeness he sang about wasn't an act, it was his reality. The end came, as it so often does in such stories, on a cold, dark road. In the final days of 1952, Hank was scheduled to play a couple of comeback shows, one on New Year's Eve in Charleston, West Virginia, and another on New Year's Day in Canton, Ohio. He was in terrible shape, a mere shadow of his former self. He was so weak that a local doctor in Montgomery had to give him injections of vitamin B12 and morphine just to get him on his feet. He hired a 17-year-old college student named Charles Carr to drive him north in his brand new baby blue Cadillac. The journey was doomed from the start. A snow and ice storm blanketed the region, forcing the cancellation of the Charleston show. They checked into the Andrew Johnson Hotel in Knoxville, Tennessee. What happened in that hotel room is shrouded in mystery and conflicting accounts. Carr would later say that Hank was feeling unwell and a doctor was called who administered 2 more shots of morphine. There are stories of empty beer cans and talk of Hank being unable to walk on his own. Sometime late on New Year's Eve, they decided to press on towards Canton, a drive of over 500 miles through the treacherous winter weather. Hank was lying in the back seat, covered with a blanket. Charles Carr, a teenager at the wheel, was driving a Ghost through a snowstorm. The historical record of that final drive is a puzzle with missing pieces. We know they were stopped by a police officer in Rutledge, Tennessee, around 11:45 p.m. Carr was fined for reckless driving. The officer looked in the back seat and saw Hank, apparently asleep. Carr later said that was the last time he heard Hank speak. They drove on through the night, a long, silent journey. At around 5:30 a.m. on New Year's Day, 1953, Carr pulled into a Pure Oil gas station in Oak Hill, West Virginia, to stretch his legs. When he went to the back of the Cadillac, he found Hank unresponsive. He touched him, and his body was cold and rigid. Carr, in a panic, drove to a nearby hospital, but it was too late. Sometime in the back of that Cadillac, alone under a blanket in the freezing cold, the lonesome voice of Hank Williams had fallen silent forever. He was just 29 years old. The official cause of death was listed as insufficiency of the right ventricle of the heart, a heart attack. But the truth is far more complex and has been debated for decades. Was it the alcohol, the morphine, the chloral hydrate prescribed by the phony doctor? Was it the years of chronic pain from his spina bifida? Or was it simply a heart that had been broken one too many times? The autopsy found hemorrhages in the heart and neck, and his body was bruised. Some have speculated about a fight in Knoxville. Others point to the lethal combination of drugs and alcohol as the clear culprit. The conman doctor, Toby Marshall, would later face legal trouble, but the full truth of his role in Hank's final months remains murky. What is certain is that Hank's body, and perhaps his spirit, had simply given out. He had lived a lifetime of pain, both physical and emotional, in just 29 short years, and he had finally reached the end of his lost highway. The news of Hank Williams's death sent a shockwave across America. He died on the very day he was meant to play a comeback show. The promoter in Canton, Ohio, had to walk out on stage and announce to a sold-out crowd that Hank Williams was dead. The audience, thinking it was just another one of Hank's no-shows, began to laugh and jeer. It was only when other performers came on stage and began to sing Hank's gospel songs, their voices breaking with emotion, that the awful truth sank in. A stunned, mournful silence fell over the auditorium. His funeral, held in Montgomery, was an event of unprecedented scale. An estimated 25,000 people, more than the entire population of Montgomery at the time, descended on the city to pay their last respects. They filed past his open casket, a silver-plated affair, to catch one last glimpse of the man whose music had been the soundtrack to their lives. He looked, as one observer noted, like a little boy who had just gone to sleep. But Hank Williams' story didn't end in that Cadillac or that casket. In a strange, almost mythical twist of fate, his death transformed him from a troubled star into an American icon. The last single released during his lifetime was a jaunty, darkly ironic tune called "I'll Never Get Out of This World Alive." In the weeks following his death, it, along with "Your Cheatin' Heart," soared to #1 on the charts. He was more popular in death than he had ever been in life. The moniker, the Hillbilly Shakespeare, became more than just a clever nickname. It became his epitaph. It captured the profound paradox of his work, songs with the simple, direct language of the common man, but with the emotional depth and universal truth of great literature. He wrote about love, loss, sin, and redemption with an honesty that was and still is startling. He gave voice to the lonely, the broken, the lost. He took the messy, often ugly realities of life and spun them into art. His influence is immeasurable. Every country songwriter who has ever put pen to paper owes him a debt. But his reach extends far beyond country music. Artists from Bob Dylan and Neil Young to Elvis Presley and Bruce Springsteen have cited him as a major influence. They recognized in him the raw, uncut power of a true original. He laid the groundwork for rock and roll, for the singer-songwriter movement, for anyone who believes that the most powerful music comes from the most honest place. He reminds us that our greatest art often comes from our deepest wounds, that there is a strange and fragile beauty in the human experience, with all its heartbreak and all its glory. He sang for the outsiders, for the people on the margins, for anyone who has ever felt so lonesome they could cry. And in doing so, he made them, and us, feel a little less alone. The story of Hank Williams is a tragedy, there's no doubt about it. A story of a monumental talent consumed by his own demons. But it's also a story of resilience, of a man who took a lifetime of pain and turned it into something that will last forever. He was a falling star that lit up the purple sky, a lonesome whippoorwill whose song will never truly fade. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.